Some of you have been looking forward to this chat. These are just kind of my thoughts recently, and this discussion can go in multiple directions, of course, as we like to do on our live streams. But um, this discussion is going to be a little bit about just some of my thoughts and some of my. It's not just some of my thoughts, as I have a philosophy background. My specialty is not in problems of epistemology or ontology. It's not my specialty. As you guys know, if you know my channel, familiar with it, my specialty is in value theory and value judgment and ethics, um, ethical theory, and actually like value measurement and value judgment, normativity. Um, but based on accumulated years of accumulated reading and going back and forth and thinking about different things, I used to I used to be very squarely in the determinist camp, in kind of a strict determinist camp, in which I would, and I'll loosely define the position. The determinist camp, strict determinism, states, or the claim of strict determinism or strict determinists is that we are completely determined. Our actions are completely caused, but also that implies that we are completely determined. We don't have anything that could be called free will. We don't have our choices, in a sense, the fact that we make choices, that we make decisions, and that we deliberate them, and all of that process. It is really merely an illusion, and we're in a very real sense predetermined, predestined to act in a certain way and to have a certain life and have certain outcomes. Now, over time, as I've really dug into, and over my years of, I think, studying um, social cognitive theory, psychology, and also neuroscience. And you might be surprised at that. Studying more neuroscience and understanding a little bit more of mechanism over time. Of course, it was part of my background is neurobiology. I have come to take more of what's called a compatibilist position. And of course, I'm not married to any position. We're all critical thinkers on this channel, right? We should be open to change our position at any time, given a better argument, better evidence, right? That's what we are. But based on the arguments that now kind of have percolated in my mind, I'm a little bit more convinced of a compatibilist position, not a pure free will position. Free will, okay, free will, the position of a free will, or of free will, and we could say they're called libertarians philosophically. Hey guys, Reese or Race, Lito, welcome. This is not the political position libertarian. It's libertarian from a philosophical, you'd say maybe an ontological, metaphysical standpoint. So libertarians, they believe that we have free will, that we are the cause of all of our own actions, and that there is complete independence in a way from physical laws. That is, I think there's no way to really make that conclusion. I think that's a very hard conclusion. Hey Nikhil, hey Tom's one Daffel. All right, I'm not gonna say all of your. If you have a really complicated username, I won't say the whole thing. I'll probably say part of it, but I want to try to welcome everybody as you come into the chat and say hi. I'll do my best. If this gets crazy, I probably won't be able to address everyone. So I think that's an untenable position. The pure free will position is, hey, Micah, welcome. The pure free will or libertarian position, I think, is untenable because, and again, it's not don't get confused by the libertarian position. I'm talking about the metaphysical position. It's untenable because I don't think you can say it's not metaphysically accurate. It's neither metaphysically nor physically accurate to say that you have that we're totally uncaused by physical laws. It's a fact. I don't think you can argue with that at all. We are constrained by physical laws. However, here's the thing. Here's where compatibilism comes in. And Daniel Dennett takes a similar position like this. Um, you know, so Daniel Dennett takes this position. John Dupre. These are all thinkers that, and they're not just philosophers. These are people who are actually. So John Dupre is a cognitive scientist. Um, uh, you know, Daniel Dennett was the late Daniel Dennett, right? Amazing guy. Actually, I think passed away in the past year or two. But basically, Daniel Dennett argued this, and he was actually a cognitive scientist as well. So it's not people who they're not arguing from very naive positions, and I think hopefully I don't think I am either. I'm going to lay out some of my thoughts though. Um, not I'm going to state a lot of a lot of these thinkers for sure. Welcome, I am chaotic harmony. Yeah. So I'm gonna lay out the argument for determinism, the rough argument, and I don't want to set up a straw man, and but I'm gonna set up a rough argument for determinism, lay out basically the central premises, and then I want to, it's not this is not new. The insights that I'm gonna provide here are not new. I'm gonna kind of restate the arguments, but I think in a little bit of a different way, in a different perspective, and I think hopefully it will become clear kind of what the position is, and if it's valid. So Blitzer 658, yeah, good. So all right, so here's the welcome. Here's the determinist argument. Okay, so all events, right? All events, all outcomes are determined by physical laws, right? And some initial conditions and the physical laws. Okay, good, fair enough. And we are physical beings. Okay, fair enough. We are physicalistic. We have, we're materialistic. And you can argue with that. I mean, whatever, you can argue with it. But suppose, right? And I agree, right? Our brains, right, are material things. Our brains are physical things. You can kind of make a distinction between mind and brain. We're not going to go there. But our brains are physical things. Our brains determine our behavior. Okay, good. So we've kind of laid that out. Now, hey Vector, hey Tech Talk. Yeah, so I'm talking about that right now, Tech Talk. So that's kind of the determinist argument. So here now is where I want to make. Here's the premise that I want to analyze here. In part of determinism, is that all outcomes are physically determined. Now, there's the word determined. And here's kind of and it's not a nitpicky thing. It'll sound like a really pedantic thing. All right? Yeah, well, we'll talk about that. Are our choices really independent? So it's going to sound like this really pedantic thing, but I think what's going on in a lot of determinist arguments, and it's not me. Again, I'm restating a lot of what other people have critiqued. I think what's going on is a form of equivocation. What is equivocation? Equivocation is the use of a term or a word in one sense and then applying it to the other sense as if it's the same meaning. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. You might use the word, and I talked about equivocation with respect to, actually in my book, about the word rational. And sometimes people use it with respect to, I think, intelligence and things like that. So rational, the word rational, let's examine that for a moment. So we can use, and you'll see how it applies to determinism in a moment. We could take apart the word rational, right? And we can apply it. How do you apply the word rational in many different situations? Well, you could say, for instance, the patient is not rational and therefore cannot consent to medical treatment or cannot consent to surgery. What do we mean in that sense? Well, we'll revisit that in a moment. Let's take another example of the word rational, the usage of the word rational. this is a rational decision. This choice A would be a more rational decision than choice B. Okay, so no, it's okay. Listen, feel free to rewatch. I'm dealing with some. In order to deal with determinism and these arguments in a concrete way, I have to introduce some things that might not be as familiar. But I'm using examples, and hopefully that will help. I will use more examples going forward. Just stay with me. Stay with me. So okay. So John, stay with me. So here, do you actually see we're using rational in two different senses? They are two distinct, they might be related in some way. Aristotle claimed that everything, all meanings and all uses of the same words tend toward the same meaning. That's debatable, but do we see how these two words these two usages of the word rational are being used differently. Now, how does this apply to determinism? I think I think that in the determinist argument, they're using the word determined in two different senses, and there is an equivocation going on. So the argument, therefore, is actually just at its root, I think, not valid because the conclusion they're claiming, okay, laws are physically determined. Well, let's understand, or laws physically determine outcomes. Well, let's understand what is being said, and then we'll talk about the type of determinism that they're making a conclusion about. So, determinism. What do they mean by that? All actions, all outcomes, and physical events are physically determined. What that means is that all outcomes can be physically predicted, right? And explained, even maybe explained physically, but those are two different things, and we'll get into it. So I agree. There's no theoretical problem with this. Let's do a little experiment, or let's do a little thought experiment. What if you could pull apart some behavior that somebody's engaging in, some choice, and you could say, well, here's the brain state of this person at a certain point in time. And we know that brain state, we can reduce that, we can predict that brain state based on certain laws of, maybe electromagnetism, certain laws of, conductivity and things like that. Kind of like the brain works kind of like a circuit. So we can use a lot of the laws that apply to circuits, for instance, electromagnetism, and so on and so forth, that apply maybe to the brain, to these brain states. And you might say, well, oh, okay, it's our behavior is partially dependent on the environment. Well, guess what? I can make physical models of the environment, right? If somebody is coming toward you or acting in a certain way, that's going to initiate another brain state. We can say, well, if we made millions of equations, if we came up with millions of equations, all right, just describing these phenomena in terms of physical laws and physical predictions, we could do it, right? Theoretically, we could do that. But why does that still not make determinism work, right? Because there's a difference, and Daniel Dennett and again John Dupre and many others have talked about this as well. What's the problem with determinism? Just saying that. Well, I don't think anybody can deny that theoretically we could predict every behavior, just setting up a bunch of millions of physicalistic equations with physical laws. But now here's where we get into some trouble, because prediction. Yeah, so John, actually, you do bring up an interesting point. I'm assuming, for the sake of the argument, that everything is actually deterministic. There's a debate within physics. Are things indeterministic? Are certain things indeterministic? The three-body problem, for instance, is there's no equation, right? There are no set of equations to solve the three-body problem. Yeah, you bring up a good point. However, a strict determinist might respond to that. Well, just because we don't have the equations, to describe it right now doesn't mean that theoretically those some equations don't exist that could in the future describe that, right? So so this is why, for the sake of argument, I'm assuming that yes, there is no indeterminism in the universe. Everything is physically deterministic. The laws, the laws apply. I'm trying to show. So, John, I'm trying to show the argument for, or demonstrate the soundness of the argument for compatibilism. All right. So, which is that yes, physical laws can determine behaviors, but it does not mean that we don't have some level of free choice and independent decision making. And I'll talk about that. So, Farzan, welcome. Um, so Nikhil, let's talk about that. Yes, okay. So you guys bring up so many good points, and I can't talk about them all. Nikhil, YouTube predicting our behavior, yes, but importantly, with some error, with some variability, right? So it's not like a if we were to theoretically reduce all of that to physical laws with no error, right, with no error value, yeah, technically we could do that. That's what I'm saying. But yeah, it's like an imperfect model still, YouTube behavior. Christian, can you reduce thoughts to brain states? I'm supposing, for the sake of our argument here, that at the very least, brain states give rise to thoughts. Okay, so um, yeah, yeah. So I'm supposing, for the sake of argument, because here's the thing: we could go down so many metaphysical rabbit holes here, um, and so for the sake of argument, I want to suppose certain things are true. This is what's called a proof by cases, or you could say a proof by cases, or reductio, right? Not really a reductio, but I'm making an assumption and building a case on that. It's more of a proof by cases. Okay, so so now let's talk about this. Where's the disconnect here? Physical laws can definitely predict outcomes, but prediction. Now here's the thing, and this is not trivial. It sounds pedantic, but it's really not trivial. Prediction is not the same as explanation. In a statistical model, yeah, you have prediction, like height can perfectly predict theoretically, let's say, not in reality, but let's say height can perfectly predict. It's a one-to-one correlation. It's actually 100% correlation. Those almost never exist, but height perfectly correlates to age, let's say. All right, so perfect correlation. And then also we have an r squared value that is, that is off the charts. R squared in statistics means how much of the variability in the model is explained. How much of the variability in the data is explained by the model, right? So what does that mean in English? It's like how much can this model, like how much predictive power does this model have? So that's about prediction. But we don't say, okay, well, height just perfectly explains. Um, so Christian, good question. Well, let's table that for a moment. Neuroimaging, maybe neuroimaging, possibly. So, yeah. So we don't say height theoretically explains age. Okay, and here's the disconnect. Do physical laws, and this is the big question, do physical laws theoretically predict all outcomes, not just have predictive power over them? Now you might say, okay, yes. But here I'm going to give you an example. I could use a biological example. John Dupre uses protein folding as an example of where you have emergent. He says like emergent biological laws that emerge. Okay, that are not reducible to physical laws. Let's talk about this for a moment. Okay, I'm going to give you the classic example of, um, so, so I'm going to give you the classical example of the ship of Theseus. Okay, for the sake of this. So now the ship of Theseus. What is the ship of Theseus? It's a classic problem in philosophy. If you have a ship, let's say you have a ship and it's made of these planks, wooden planks. And one by one, you take a plank, just over time, you take a plank and then replace it with another plank. So first you start with the whole ship, and you take, maybe you're repairing it or something. You take a plank away from the ship, and then you replace it with another plank. And you keep doing this. And over time, you do this so much that eventually you have, like none of the planks of the original ship are in the new ship. None of them. Okay? So, John, very good question. They're actually separate from this discussion. They're related to this discussion, but they're a little bit separate. Um, they are related. I will kind of touch on that. But um, okay, so the question is, and how does it relate to determinism? John Dupre and certainly Daniel Dennett and these thinkers seem to think is something like this is related. Well, what is this showing? We're showing that the identity of the thing. This is a ship. This is a ship, right? So this is a ship. It has some form and function. It is not reducible to just its wooden components. And then and to kind of prove this, we can use information theory. Information theory, like a core tenet of information theory, is for you to have a good system or a good model, right? You should have minimal information loss from one phenomena or one event to another. So here, I would argue that if we just reduce a ship to the sum of its parts to its wooden planks, you have information loss there because we have lost the form and we have lost the function of the ship. And we lose information. If you, for instance, if you say, well, a ship is just a collection of wooden planks, we've lost information because imagine that description, right? A bunch of wooden planks. Well, you can lay a bunch of wooden planks on the floor, and it's not a ship, right? Now, again, you might think that this is pedantic, but it's examples like these, and we don't have time to go through so many, but it's examples like these that talk about structure and function that serve as examples of that ontologically, meaning kind of the study of being, like what exists. We can't simply strictly reduce the physical phenomena, every phenomenon in all levels, in all domains of science and reality, to purely physical ones, even if, just like the ship, the physical parts do make up are a very important property of that higher level system. All right, so the ship of Theseus is kind of an example of this. Yeah, let me just see. A question would be, if we woke up 1,000 years in the future, say, but does that information get lost to you? So, yeah, so that's, yeah. Okay, yeah. There's a lot to unpack here. I don't want to go in too many directions here because these are great questions. These are great questions. If you want to actually talk more about this stuff, feel free to reach out to me personally, but we could go in too many directions here. So I want to stay on the topic of specifically determinism. So this example shows, and many people argue, okay, well, different levels of causation and different emergent properties, in terms of model design and what's called parsimony. Parsimony means, don't add more explanations. Don't add more explanations. If the simplest explanation is good enough, don't add more explanations. We go back to predictive power versus explanatory power. How does this relate? So I think sometimes I've heard the criticism, at least from different people, that, hey, if you're going from physics to let's say physical laws to every external event, that's the most sorry, let me rephrase this. If you are taking physical laws and using purely physical laws to explain all events that involve social outcomes, it involves maybe biological outcomes at multiple levels, then this is the most parsimonious model. This is the most parsimonious explanation, actually. What does that mean? What does that mean? The claim here on the part of determinists is that, as strict determinists, is if you take all these physical laws and you take all these in just physical explanations, it is, yeah, it is what? It's the simplest explanation, not only the simplest explanation, but no more explanation is necessary than these simplest explanations. I'm going to kind of take a hammer to that because I dispute that a lot. Let's compare models, right? Again, theoretically, even theoretically, it's would be potentially impossible to do. But theoretically, if you had maybe a quantum computer, a very powerful quantum computer that could lay out, let's say, a physical, a social event, let's say something in history, World War II, let's say, all right? What caused World War II? Well, let's explain World War II, the causes of World War II and the results of World War II. Let's explain that in terms of only physical laws. What would you need? Well, you would need what? Millions, hundreds of millions maybe, of physical equations, right? Physics equations, all related to each other in some way, partial derivations and things like that, to explain World War II, right? The outcome of World War II, or the causes and the results of World War II. You'd need hundreds of millions of equations to deal with that, theoretically. All right, let's compare that to, because we're challenging the view that it's more parsimonious to explain these outcomes in terms of physics. Well, like the simplest explanation. Well, let's compare that. Let's compare that in terms of explanatory power. Again, we're talking about explanatory, not predictive power. Theoretically, we could use all those physics equations to predict the outcomes of World War II. We could. Theoretically, that's sound. Again, the question is, can you explain? Is it a good explanatory model? No, it's not. No, it's not. The social sciences provide better explanatory models. Why? They're simpler. They have fewer components. They still have a lot of components. And theoretically, they're still actually not a good way to predict, let's say, something like a war or an economic downturn. There still aren't. But in theory, it's a simpler model. It's definitely a simpler model. Let's take now decision making, free will, right? Okay, can you use hundreds of millions of physics equations to predict your choices? Absolutely. No doubt. No doubt. Can we explain your choices in terms of solely those physics equations? Hundreds of millions of them. No. It's not as good an explanation as, for instance, triadic reciprocal determinism. You can look this up. It's Bandura's social cognitive theory. Okay, social cognitive theory. You can explain anybody's choices much better and not only predict with some level of accuracy, with varying level of accuracy, with error, right? There's always error in these things. But you can not only predict them with a high level of accuracy, for instance, computational neuroscience, computational psychology, right? You can use those models to, a lot of the models in those fields, to predict human behavior. And those are simpler. Those, yes, they still involve many, many equations. In order to predict even just a single choice, you'd need many, many equations, potentially. But it's not hundreds of millions of equations. So there are fewer equations involved to explain the same phenomenon, right? And so in terms of just simply a scientific point of view, in terms of valuing parsimony in a model, the higher level ones, the higher level explanations, the higher level causal explanations have more explanatory power than the physical ones. And so that's where compatibilism comes in. That's where, that essence of free will comes in. It's that these higher level phenomena aren't simply reducible to the physical ones. Information gets lost if we try to reduce the higher level phenomena to the simpler, to the lower level physical phenomena. So information, right, it violates some principles of information theory. And so ontologically, meaning in terms of the fact that they exist, their existence. Ontologically, they're legitimate. These higher level phenomena are legitimate. And so explaining choices in terms of, for instance, triadic reciprocal determinism, Bandura's theory, for instance, or installation theory. Um, so yeah, so basically that's the idea. Um, so yeah, actually, let me respond to this. Parsimony isn't just about simplicity. Yeah, okay. Yes, and let's be clear, because maybe I wasn't clear enough. Parsimony is not just about simplicity. It's not just about simplicity. Parsimony, okay, is the simplest explanation, such that, right? Simplicity is part of it, but not the whole story. Parsimony means we want the simplest explanation, or we want the simplest model, right? With the fewest necessary components, right? We don't want to, Occam would say, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. It comes from William of Occam, right? So what that means is, if you have one explanation for something, don't introduce an additional explanation and an additional explanation. If you have one thing, if you have two, for instance, if you in physics, if you have one explanation for why a rock falls, gravitational force, then you don't need to introduce like magic or something, right? That would be a good example. You don't need to introduce like ether or something like that, right? Which ether was not explanation for a rock falling, but ether was a thing, was an idea. So there would be so okay. So it's about making fewer assumptions. It's not just about making fewer assumptions, but even we can run with that. So even if we can explain it with a gazillion equations, there's still a problem, right? There's still a problem with information loss. Like for instance, um, AIC, right? There's AIC, BIC. There are these information theoretical approaches to evaluating models. Um, if you were, and again, we'd actually have to do the math. We'd have to do the math. We'd have to do the math. But in terms of rating a model, like how much information is lost from in a model, it's a pretty good, you know, assessment of it. Those principles, those criteria. Um, and yeah, though they're just simpler models. They're not only simpler, but they're simpler and they do also make fewer assumptions. I would argue. I would argue. Right. So I would argue that for instance, sorry, why am I blanking out? Reciprocal determinism, triadic reciprocal determinism, is it requires fewer assumptions. Right. There are three variables. They're big categories, though, of course, but they're essentially three variables that determine any personal decision. Right. So it's simple. It doesn't make quite that many assumptions. Um, the assumptions are fairly good. It's a robust model. We can use it to apply to many situations, many samples, many and so on and so forth. That might be a kind of a splitting hairs thing, right? We'd actually have to see which one is more parsimonious. Regardless of which one, I think the social models for social explanations tend to be more parsimonious. I would still maintain my position there, but yeah, it's actually perfectly a valid area of debate. And if it were shown that it was more parsimonious theoretically, one versus the other, it's a serious question. I probably would change my mind if I had some better argument that somebody made that those millions of equations are less presumptive and more parsimonious. All right. But that does also leave, even if we solve that problem, it does also leave the problem of, again, information loss. I think information loss goes both ways. I think if you try to explain everything in terms of, again, we take the ship of Theseus example. If we try to explain everything purely in terms of the components or the material components, it's a rough example. It's not a perfect analogy. but if we try to explain everything in terms of, or the identity of that thing in terms of solely its material components, we lose information about how it's structured, what the function is, and so on and so forth. All right, and so I think, there's again, it's kind of like in a sense, I'm almost like making the case for different sciences, right, other than physics, right? Um, so let's see, like I'm making the case that yeah, there isn't just physics. There also is legitimately chemistry. There is also legitimately biology. There is legitimately sociology. There is legitimately psychology. There's neuroscience, and these are legitimate things that I don't think, for again all the reasons I stated, can be or even should be reduced to simply physical explanations. Um, John Dupre would argue, John Dupre, who, again, he's a cognitive scientist. He would argue that all of these levels have their own emergent laws that aren't strictly reducible to physical laws. Again, it's a deeper rabbit hole. But Ben, you say, I mean, it probably is splitting hairs. I do agree that it's hard to conceptualize equations explaining something as completely as like a social theorem. It is hard to conceptualize, but I think that's still not an argument against determinism. That we can't conceptualize it. Again, models are just equations. That's it. I mean, I am oversimplifying a little bit, but models are, because not all models, strictly speaking, are equations. But like when we get down to the bare bones of it, models are mathematical for the most part. Models are equations. They're equations. So it's just a difference of how many equations do you have, and how many, what is the system that you're looking at to predict. Here's another kind of just, oh, I'm going over. I have so much more to talk about with respect to this subject. I think I could go a lot as well. But yeah, there was one more example that I wanted to give, and yeah. So yeah, agnostic on determinism. Here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line of all this. I do think still, let's put it this way, for practical purposes, it's still better to believe that you're free than not to. And I'll say why. For practical purposes, there is actually good research in the social sciences and in social cognitive theory that the more you believe in, it's called self-efficacy theory, the more you believe that you are effective in controlling the outcome of your choices, the more you actually, and this is well documented, the more control you tend to have, or the better you are able to direct your outcomes. If you don't want to use the word control, the more executive function you can exert over outcomes, and so on and so forth. So it's probably a better thing just from a practical standpoint. Yeah, mega B. I would actually agree with you. I think that's what is called the compatibilist position. So one sense of determinism, it doesn't just like from one sense of determinism, using that word from one sense, yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not free, that there isn't some, what Daniel Dennett called in his book. He has a book called, I think it was his first book on this topic, called Wiggle Room, right? We have some wiggle room. So yeah. So anyway, guys, I really appreciate this discussion. Feel free to go check out my channel if you're not subscribed already. If you want to work with me personally, feel free to check out my Critical Thinking Academy. You can find the link in pretty much any of the description of any video. And guys, if you want to have conversations with me personally, I love these types of conversations. I love critical thinking. I love critical thinking just all the time. Feel free to reach out to me personally and have conversations with me as well. I welcome that. So, guys, I'm here every Wednesday, and I will see you next Wednesday.